I sit here now, in the same kitchen where I've spent so many mornings, the sound of my dad's coffee brewing filling the silence between us. It's strange how life can change so much, so quickly. One moment, you're living what feels like the dream, and the next, you're questioning everything that you thought was solid. I never imagined I'd be sitting here, pouring my heart out like this, not even sure how to start or where to end. Thank you, by the way, for listening to this story. I never thought I'd be saying these words to anyone, let alone sharing them on something as public as this. But my heart is heavy, and if this can help someone else out there, then maybe this is worth it. I know some of you might not get it, might even judge me, but sometimes, the truth is more complicated than what we let people see. So, here goes. I was married to Jake for 12 years, a good man on paper, a hard worker, and the father of our 2 beautiful kids. Our life, on the outside, was everything I ever dreamed of. Everything anyone would envy. But, like most things, it wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Not anymore, at least. You know how people always say, don't go to bed angry. Well, I guess we stopped following that advice a long time ago. Jake and I used to be the kind of couple that couldn't get enough of each other. The little things like holding hands on a walk, kissing goodbye, or just looking at each other like we knew something nobody else did, those things mattered. They made me feel like we were in this together, no matter what. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling invisible. The first sign I remember noticing was right after we had our second child. Life had changed for both of us, of course. But when Jake's attention started to fade, I didn't know how to get it back. Our first child, Charlie, was a handful, running around, asking questions, needing constant attention. I got that. But once we brought Lily into the world, Jake seemed to retreat into his work. He wasn't physically gone, but mentally. I couldn't reach him anymore. Our nights became quiet, routine. No passion. No spark. I tried talking to him about it. At first, I blamed the stress of our growing family, his long hours at the office, the new responsibilities piling up. I told myself it would get better once things settled down. But months passed, and nothing changed. I felt like I was living with a stranger. A man who was present but distant. A man who barely touched me, let alone looked at me the way he used to. Every time I tried to bring it up, he'd shrug it off or promise that things would get better. But they didn't. It wasn't just about sex, you know. It was the way he stopped noticing the small things. The way he didn't ask how my day went anymore, or how the kids were doing in school. It was like he'd forgotten how to care, and I didn't know how to get his attention back. The worst part? He didn't seem to notice that I was withdrawing too. Or maybe, he just didn't care. I remember one evening, after another failed attempt to talk to him, I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the empty space where he used to lie beside me. I could hear his breathing from across the room, but I felt miles away. It was the first time I thought, is this it? Is this what it feels like when a marriage dies? I didn't want to admit it, but I was lonely. So lonely. And that was when I started noticing Greg. Greg was our neighbor. He'd moved in a few months before, and at first, we barely spoke beyond the typical neighbor pleasantries. He was friendly, in his 40s, and a single guy who worked in some kind of tech job. I always thought he was nice enough, but I never really paid much attention to him. Until one day, when Jake was away on a business trip, Greg noticed that I was struggling with a flat tire on my car. It was just a simple thing that him offering to help me, lending a hand with a tool and a smile. But something about it stuck with me. I don't know if it was because I was in a place where I felt so unseen, or if it was just that simple act of kindness, but for the first time in a long while, someone saw me. Really saw me. I don't know if I ever told Jake this, but Greg would sometimes come over to chat. He'd bring over a bottle of wine, and we'd talk about our kids, or how the neighborhood was shaping up, or even share stories about life before our little bubble of suburbia. I wasn't looking for anything from him, not at first. I wasn't trying to fill the empty spaces Jake had left in our home. But somehow, Greg filled them without even trying. He'd laugh at my stories. He'd listen without interrupting. And he made me feel, well, wanted. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't like I was planning anything. It wasn't even on my mind. But when Greg would smile and say something encouraging, something about it made me feel good. That probably sounds stupid, right? But when your husband stops looking at you like you're the most important person in the room, when every conversation with him feels like a task you have to force, you start to notice the small things. And those small things can be a hell of a lot more powerful than you realize. Greg never crossed any boundaries at first. But I started to find myself looking forward to his visits, even when I tried not to. And that was when the guilt hit. I should have told Jake how I was feeling, but I didn't. I didn't know how. I didn't want to fight. I didn't want to be the one to cause problems. So, I kept quiet. But inside, I was torn. I missed my husband. I missed the man I fell in love with, the man who used to look at me like I was everything. And then, one night, Greg came over. And that's when things began to change. Greg came over on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun was setting. Jake was away on yet another business trip, and I was left with the kids and a pile of laundry. As usual, Greg offered to help when he noticed me struggling with a bag of groceries. He asked if I needed a hand, and despite the weariness weighing on me, I agreed. We ended up sitting on my front porch with a couple of beers, talking about nothing in particular. But there was a quiet comfort in his company, something I hadn't felt in ages. As we chatted, I started to feel a warmth creeping into my chest. Something simple, like the feeling of someone truly listening. Greg wasn't pushing me to talk about my personal life, but he could sense my discomfort. It was the way he asked questions and waited for real answers instead of just the usual small talk. I didn't expect much from these conversations. I didn't want to think about my marriage problems right then. But that night, Greg mentioned how he could relate to feeling disconnected. How he missed the days when relationships were easy and full of passion. It felt strange, hearing someone else's frustrations with love so openly, but I appreciated it. It was refreshing to hear that someone understood how I felt without judgment. After a while, our talks became more frequent. It wasn't anything overtly flirtatious. It was just two people sharing parts of their lives that felt too heavy to bear alone. I wasn't seeking anything beyond that. Just a friend who didn't make me feel like a burden. But, deep down, I knew something was changing in me. I looked forward to Greg's visits. His presence filled the silence that had become unbearable when Jake was around. And there was something in Greg's eyes when he looked at me, something that reminded me of a time before everything had gone quiet in my own marriage. One evening, after a particularly long conversation about life and missed chances, I found myself laughing more than I had in months. And when Greg smiled at me, that was when it hit me, something was happening, and it wasn't as simple as friendly company anymore. But I didn't want to acknowledge it. It was just too dangerous to admit. I went inside after Greg left, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. For the first time in a long while, I felt seen. It was a Thursday evening when things changed. Jake had been away on a business trip for a few days, and I was starting to feel the weight of his absence, both physically and emotionally. I was used to managing the kids, the house, everything on my own. But lately, it all felt so much heavier. And that night, I just couldn't take it anymore. Greg knocked on my door around 7 p.m., carrying a bottle of wine. Had texted earlier, offering to bring something over to help me unwind. I was hesitant, but I figured I could use the company, even if it was just for a little while. We sat on the couch, wine glasses in hand, talking about the usual things. But as the evening wore on, the conversation drifted from casual to personal. He asked about my marriage, his tone gentle but persistent. "How are you really doing, Sarah?" he asked, his eyes steady on mine. "You don't have to pretend everything's fine." Something about the way he asked it made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in a long time. I felt the familiar knot in my chest tighten as I began to speak more openly about how disconnected Jake and I had become. I admitted that I felt unloved, unnoticed, like I was just another piece of the furniture in our home. It wasn't a huge confession, but to me, it felt like a dam breaking. Greg listened, his face softening with empathy. "You deserve more than that," he said quietly. There was a sincerity in his voice that reached deep inside me. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear those words until they were out there in the air, hanging between us. We were sitting close now, so close that I could feel the heat of his body next to mine. My heart raced a little, my mind a mess of confusion and guilt. But the loneliness I'd been carrying for so long overshadowed any sense of right and wrong. And then, almost as if it was inevitable, he leaned in. The kiss was sudden. A mix of desire, relief, and a little bit of desperation. His lips were soft, yet firm, and I couldn't pull away, even though I knew I should. For a moment, it felt like all the weight I'd been carrying disappeared. It was just the two of us, in that moment, sharing something real. Something I hadn't had in years. But as soon as it ended, the guilt hit me like a tidal wave. I pulled back, my breath shaky, heart pounding. I shouldn't have done that," I whispered. "I'm married, Greg." He didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, his expression unreadable. I didn't know what to expect from him. Was he going to regret it? Was I going to regret it? But instead, he said quietly, "You deserve to feel wanted, Sarah. You don't have to feel guilty for that." And that's when I knew that I had crossed a line. And nothing would ever be the same again. After that night, everything felt different. I told myself it was a mistake. That I had let my emotions get the better of me. But deep down, I knew something had shifted, something I couldn't undo. The kiss lingered in my mind every moment I wasn't distracted by the kids or the mundane tasks that filled my days. Greg didn't mention it the next time we spoke, and neither did I. We acted like it never happened. But there was an unspoken tension between us now. It was in the way we made eye contact, in the way our words seemed more loaded than before. I couldn't stop thinking about him, and I could tell he couldn't stop thinking about me either. I tried to keep my distance. After all, I was still married. Jake might not have been present emotionally, but he was still there. I didn't want to betray him further. But every time Greg came over, I felt that pull like a magnetic force drawing me to him. And honestly, part of me wanted to give in. I hadn't felt alive in so long, hadn't felt seen by anyone the way Greg saw me. One afternoon, a few weeks later, it happened again. I was sitting in my living room, folding laundry, when Greg knocked on the door. It was one of those unexpected visits, the kind where he just wanted to check in and see how I was doing. I tried to be casual, even though my pulse quickened when I saw him standing there with that familiar smile. We talked for a while, nothing unusual at first. He shared a story about something funny that had happened at work, and we laughed. But then, in the middle of our conversation, the air between us grew thick. The sound of the kids playing outside, the ticking of the clock on the wall, all of it seemed to fade away. It was just the two of us in that moment, locked in an unspoken understanding that neither of us could deny. Without thinking, I moved closer to him. I don't even know what made me do it. My heart was racing, and I could feel my cheeks flushing. Before I could stop myself, I kissed him again. Only this time, it was different. It was longer, deeper. My hands found their way to his chest, and for a moment, I felt like I was completely lost in the feeling of being wanted, of being important again. When we finally pulled apart, I felt a rush of guilt, mixed with something else I couldn't name. We didn't say anything. He didn't apologize. I didn't either. But I knew this time, I had crossed a line that I couldn't erase. It wasn't just a kiss anymore. It was something more, something that was going to change everything. I had betrayed Jake, yes, but in that moment, I wasn't thinking about him. I wasn't thinking about my marriage or my family. I was thinking about myself. About the woman I used to be, the one who felt seen and desired. And I didn't know how to stop. The days after that kiss were the hardest. I thought I could pretend it didn't matter, that it was just another mistake, another weak moment. But it kept happening. Each time I saw Greg, I could feel the tension building between us. The pull was undeniable, and the more I tried to fight it, the more intense it became. The guilt gnawed at me, but I also couldn't ignore the part of me that had never felt more alive. Jake returned from his trip, and things were awkward. Not because of anything specific he did, but because I knew that the space between us had grown wider. I'd crossed a line, and no amount of normalcy could hide the truth anymore. I started avoiding him more, not out of anger, but because it was easier than facing the emptiness I felt when we were together. I started to resent Jake's absence. Not just physically, but emotionally. He had stopped being the person I relied on. The person who saw me. I found myself longing for Greg's presence more and more. He was always there when I needed him, even if it was just a smile or a conversation that lasted longer than it should have. He knew exactly what to say, how to make me feel like I mattered. One night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself at Greg's door again. I didn't know why I went, but I knew I couldn't fight it anymore. He opened the door with a look that told me he had been expecting me. It was as if we were both walking this dangerous line, but neither of us could pull back. This time, there were no words. We didn't need them. The kiss was inevitable, like we were both drawn together by forces we couldn't control. And as we moved from the doorway into his living room, I didn't think about Jake. I didn't think about anything except the feeling of being wanted. We didn't stop. That night, I gave myself over to it completely. I let go of every doubt, every ounce of guilt. I was no longer the wife, the mother, the person who had sacrificed so much. For the first time in a long while, I felt like me again. But as the night came to an end, and I returned home, the reality of what I had done hit me harder than anything before. I had crossed a point of no return. The lies, the guilt, the regret, it all hit at once, and I couldn't escape it. I knew I had to face the consequences, but I also knew I had already begun unraveling. And there was no going back from that. Not anymore. This is my story. Thank you for subscribing. Because of you I can create more videos. Take care.